Stay with us, because what you are about to learn might completely change how you see this war. NATO flags rising across Eastern Europe. Explosions lighting up the night sky. These images have become burned into our collective memory. But here is the question most people never stop to ask. Was NATO expansion really the whole story behind Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Most headlines give you one answer, one villain, one cause. But history rarely works that way. What if the real reasons behind this war run far deeper than a military alliance? What if there are layers, political, ideological, and historical, that most people have never even considered? This decades-long expansion set the stage for everything that followed. The Soviet Union collapsed, and almost overnight, Ukraine emerged as an independent nation, one of the largest countries in Europe, sitting right on Russia's doorstep. For Moscow, this was already a seismic shock. But what followed over the next 3 decades would prove even more unsettling. NATO, the military alliance originally built to counter Soviet power, didn't shrink after the Cold War ended. It expanded. Country after country that once sat behind the Iron Curtain began joining the Western alliance. Poland in 1999, the Baltic states in 2004. Each new member moved NATO's eastern boundary closer to Russian territory. That single declaration planted a seed of genuine strategic anxiety in the Kremlin, one that would grow steadily over the next 14 years, quietly feeding the conditions for what was coming. NATO leaders gathered for a summit that would quietly reshape the entire trajectory of European security. The alliance issued a declaration with one defining sentence: Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. No timeline, no roadmap, just a promise hanging in the air. For Western leaders, it was a diplomatic gesture, carefully vague, designed to satisfy both sides. But for Russia, it was anything but vague. Moscow heard something far more alarming, a direct signal that its neighbor, sharing over 1,000 miles of border, would one day host NATO infrastructure. Vladimir Putin, who attended part of that summit, made his opposition unmistakably clear. What had previously felt like political posturing suddenly carried real weight. From Moscow's perspective, every new NATO member state was not just a diplomatic development, but a military installation inching closer to Russian soil. Russia had long argued that Western assurances made after the Cold War, though never formally written, implied NATO would not expand eastward. Whether those assurances were real or imagined, Russia treated them as broken promises, and each expansion deepened that resentment. At the same time, something significant was happening inside Ukraine itself. The country was not simply being pulled toward the west by outside forces. Ukrainian society, especially after the 2004 Orange Revolution and the 2014 Maidan Uprising, was actively choosing a European identity. New governments pursued closer ties with the European Union and distanced themselves from Moscow. For Russia, this was the worst possible combination. External military expansion and internal Ukrainian political transformation were happening simultaneously, creating what Moscow saw as an accelerating threat it could no longer afford to ignore. And that changed the entire nature of what was coming next. Ukraine didn't just talk about joining NATO and the European Union, it wrote that commitment directly into its constitution. This wasn't a campaign promise or a diplomatic statement. This was permanent, legal, and unmistakable. For Russia, this crossed a threshold that no amount of negotiation could easily walk back. Think about what that means from Moscow's perspective. A neighboring country, one Russia considered within its sphere of influence, had now legally locked itself into a Western future. Not symbolically, but constitutionally. Putin and Russian officials had long warned that Ukraine's Western alignment was unacceptable. Now it was enshrined in law. But the fact that Russia formalized them at all tells you something critical about how serious Moscow considered the situation to be. Russia didn't just complain through diplomatic back channels. They put their demands in writing and handed them formally to NATO. These weren't vague complaints. They were specific, sweeping, and frankly stunning in their scope. Russia demanded a complete halt to all future NATO expansion, full stop. They demanded no military infrastructure or presence in Ukraine whatsoever. But it went even further than that. Moscow called for a total rollback of Western military influence across Eastern Europe, essentially demanding that NATO return to where it stood before 1997. Think about what that means. Russia wasn't just asking about Ukraine's membership status. The clock began ticking towards something catastrophic. They were never really just about Ukraine. They were about something far larger. Moscow was essentially presenting the West with an ultimatum to redraw the entire European security architecture, the very framework that had governed the continent since the Cold War ended. Russia wanted legal guarantees that NATO would freeze in place permanently, that Eastern Europe would become a buffer zone, and that American military influence would retreat westward. This was not a bilateral dispute between two neighboring countries. But beyond military alliances and security demands lies something far more unsettling, an ideological belief that many analysts consider the most dangerous layer of this entire conflict. In July 2021, Vladimir Putin published a lengthy essay titled "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians." In it, he argued that Russians and Ukrainians are not two separate peoples but one single nation, artificially divided by historical circumstance and Western manipulation. He claimed Ukraine as a nation-state was essentially a Soviet-era construction with no genuine independent identity. This is where the conflict transforms entirely. If you accept Putin's framing, this is no longer simply about where a military alliance's eastern boundary sits. It becomes something far deeper, a struggle over identity, historical memory, and civilizational belonging. The question stops being about borders and starts being about whether Ukraine has the right to exist as a distinct nation at all. That is a fundamentally different kind of conflict. Now here is where things get philosophically dangerous. If Putin genuinely believes Ukraine is not a separate nation, but simply a misguided extension of Russia, then the invasion stops being purely about military strategy. It becomes something far more unsettling. It becomes an ideological mission, a belief that you are not invading a foreign country, but rather reclaiming something that was always yours. And that framing matters enormously. Because when a leader wraps military action inside a historical narrative, it becomes much harder to challenge or negotiate. History becomes a weapon. Identity becomes justification. This is not unique to Russia. Throughout the 20th century, governments have used rewritten or selectively told histories to justify expansion, suppression, and war. The question viewers should sit with is this: when does a historical claim become a tool of modern aggression? And who gets to decide which version of history is legitimate enough to justify sending in the tanks? In the days immediately before the invasion, something significant was happening in eastern Ukraine. The Donbas region, already scarred by 8 years of low-level conflict since 2014, suddenly saw a dramatic spike in ceasefire violations and violence. According to monitoring data, thousands of recorded incidents were logged in just a matter of days, a sharp and undeniable surge compared to previous weeks. Shelling intensified, civilian evacuations began, and the front lines grew dangerously active. Now, who was responsible for this escalation remains genuinely disputed. Ukrainian forces, Russian-backed separatists, and outside observers all offered conflicting accounts. But here is what matters for understanding what came next. Regardless of who fired first or why, this surge in violence created exactly the kind of volatile, emotionally charged atmosphere that could justify dramatic action. The timing was not coincidental. The conditions for escalation were now fully in place, and the world was about to witness the consequences. What happened in the Donbass in those final days before the invasion was not just background noise. It became the moment Russia had been waiting for, a public justification wrapped in the language of protection and humanitarian concern. Whether the violence was organic, provoked, or deliberately manufactured remains genuinely contested. But what is documented is the scale. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which had been monitoring the region since 2014, recorded thousands of ceasefire violations in the days leading up to February 24, 2022. Their reports showed a dramatic and measurable spike in shelling activity across the contact line. Russia pointed directly to this data, claiming Ukrainian forces were attacking Russian-speaking civilians in Donetsk and Luhansk. The OSCE numbers gave that claim a surface of credibility, even if the interpretation remained deeply disputed. A triggering moment had arrived, documented, time-stamped, and ready to be used. It reflects something deeper about how history, security, and identity shape the way nations justify their most consequential decisions. On February 24, 2022, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Missiles struck cities. Columns of tanks crossed the border from multiple directions. The world watched in disbelief as a war most hoped would never come became undeniably real. Within hours, two completely different narratives emerged. Western governments and international bodies called it exactly what it looked like, an unprovoked act of aggression against a sovereign nation, a violation of international law, and a direct assault on the post-World War II global order. Russia, however, framed it differently. Moscow called it a special military operation, describing it as a necessary and protective response to threats it claimed had been building for years. What followed on February 24, 2022, sent shockwaves across every corner of the globe. Within days, Europe was witnessing the largest armed conflict on its soil since World War II. Millions of civilians were displaced, cities were reduced to rubble, and the international order that had held, however imperfectly, for nearly 8 decades was shaken to its core. Sanctions, emergency summits, weapons shipments, and refugee crises unfolded simultaneously across dozens of nations. The sheer scale of destruction made one thing undeniable. This was not a regional skirmish. This was a civilizational rupture. And that is precisely why reducing it to a single headline, NATO provoked Russia, or Russia simply wanted conquest, does a profound disservice to the truth. When a conflict of this magnitude erupts, the causes run deep, layered across decades of history, ideology, and power. Understanding those layers is not optional. It is essential. It means seeing it clearly, and that clarity is exactly what the world needs right now. The invasion of Ukraine was not the result of a single decision, a single alliance, or a single moment in history. What we have explored throughout this video reveals something far more complex. NATO expansion created genuine security anxieties in Moscow, but it was one thread among many. Ukraine's internal political transformation toward the West. Putin's deeply held belief that Russians and Ukrainians share one civilizational identity, Russia's sweeping demands to redraw European security architecture, and the violence that erupted in Donbass in the days before the invasion, all of these forces converged simultaneously. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this conversation is too important to leave unfinished. Who truly gets to decide a country's future? Is it the people living within its borders? The neighboring powers who feel threatened by its choices? Or the global alliances competing for influence across continents? This war did not begin on February 24, 2022. It began decades earlier in the collapse of empires, the expansion of alliances, the rewriting of constitutions, and the weaponizing of history itself. NATO was part of the story, but only part. Beneath it all lies a deeper struggle over identity, sovereignty, and who holds the power to shape an entire region's destiny.